Okay, hello everyone. It's fantastic to see you all here today. It's a jam-packed camaraderie, so thank you all for coming. My name's Terry Humphreys. I'm here from Curtin University, and I'm just going to introduce this evening's events. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on today, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I'd like to pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. You all came here to hear these excellent speakers, and I'm going to hand it over to Tamsin Collins, who's done a fantastic job at organising this event, and she's going to be doing all the introductions, so thank you.
So tonight's event is a joint event between the Chemaraderies series and the industry group. So it's a relatively new group. It's only been up and running about a year. We've had one trip to CSBP as a tour, which was brilliant and really successful. And we had one social event to do Super Golf in March. So this is our first sort of big evening do, and it's great to have everybody come out and have all of our speakers tonight. So thank you very, very much. So we chose to go with aluminium tonight because of the industry members, or for RACI members, after CSBP, who we had the largest number of members involved in. As a group, aluminium industry was where our next largest number of members were involved in. So that's why we targeted aluminium as a topic. So aluminium in WA is also very big. WA produces a large amount of aluminium, is top tier producer for the world, and for reaching our net carbon standards that we want to get to by 2050, we're going to need a lot of things that involve aluminium. If we think about our solar panels, all our cables to get things around the place, even our screens involve a bit of aluminium. And tonight we do have Alcoa, South 32, Carbon Sink and WARRL. So we shall get on with it and enjoy the evening. So to start off with, we have Dr. Chris Baker, who's going to talk to us about decarbonisation. He's from Alcoa. He's the director of the refining technology.
Plan tonight in a pretty brief presentation was to give briefly an overview of how aluminium is actually produced, the steps, talk a little bit about Alcoa, what Alcoa does globally and in WA, and then talk about what we're doing in aluminium and in alumina decarbonisation. But before getting into that, I wanted to go back to some background on aluminium, because it's really an important material in our decarbonisation journey, I guess, as a society produce. So 3 properties that aluminium has make it a really useful material for society. It's got very high electrical conductivity. About 60% of copper's conductivity, and yet its density is dramatically lower, around 1/3 of the density of copper. So in terms of running overhead power lines, which with the decarbonising society means there's more electricity flowing around the grid, you need more power lines. That's an important element there. It also has a massive application in lightweighting because of its low density compared to steel. It supplants steel and saves quite a lot of either energy in terms of fuel or materials in terms of, for example, batteries or energy supply to transportation. So an important material, apart from all the other uses that you're probably familiar with in terms of decarbonising transition. On the other hand, it's energy intensive to produce, and I'll talk about that a bit more. Something that's really fundamental in this discussion, and I'm really happy to see that it's going to be discussed more tonight, is recycling. So life cycle studies have found that about 75% of aluminium ever extracted is still in use. So looking at aluminium production, and I think it's useful to clarify what the steps are and what is done in different countries or regions. First step is obviously to mine it. The sort of reddy brown ore. The bar process is used to extract the soluble aluminium trihydroxide or gibbsite from the gangue, which becomes the residue in the process. And that aluminium trihydroxide, or I think in the industry we mostly call it hydrate, is then calcined to alumina, Al2O3, which is the material that is then fed into the smelters to make the aluminium metal. And this smelting step is in particular enormously energy hungry to achieve that reduction. So talking a bit about, okay, what we have in operation though is, first of all, in terms of mines, we have mines in Western Australia and in Brazil. We have refineries in particularly Western Australia and Brazil, but also in Spain. And then the smelting stage of the process, which I mentioned is very energy, even more energy intensive than refining. We have a smelter in Victoria, in Brazil, a couple of smelters in Brazil, and particularly in Northern Europe, US, and one in Spain. Now this congregation up here is no coincidence because there's enormous quantities of hydropower there, and that's really important to the smelting operations. Okay, so in Western Australia, we run two mines. So the Huntley bauxite mine, which feeds Kwinana Refinery and Pinjarra Refinery. So Kwinana Refinery is unfortunately currently curtailed. It stopped earlier this year. Pinjarra is very much alive and kicking. We also have a Willowdale bauxite mine a little bit further south, and that feeds the Wagerup Alumina Refinery. So those mine sites have crushers at the mine and then conveyor belts that feed the alumina down to the refinery. And then ports at Bunbury and Kwinana to export alumina. Now, I wanted to make a point here is that none of the aluminium related businesses in WA export bauxite. The bauxite is processed to alumina, and the bar process for processing to alumina is quite an intensive transformation. It's quite a significant one. So these refineries in WA are also quite significant globally because they make a significant portion of global. Alumina refineries are very greenhouse gas economical, low in their greenhouse gas intensity, about half the industry average, less than half the industry average. And I think this is a really important point, and I'm quite... moving on to the mining side here, I guess the first point I'd like to make is that we're not mining in old growth forest. All of the areas that are mined have previously been logged, sometimes 2 or 3 times over the period since settlement. So it's not old growth logging, which is sometimes what I see in the media. About 75% of the mined area, or more than 75% of mined areas has been rehabilitated. There was actually a major mining area up near Jarrahdale, and that mine's been completely closed and rehabilitated. And the way the mining works, it's a cycle of mining a fairly specific region with forest either side of it, and that's done for 2 reasons. One is because the ore is dispersed in areas that are viable and non-viable. The processes, the geological processes that produce the ore require water, so there tends to be areas where water's percolated through and created alumina in the right form. But what that also does is means that there's fingers of original forest adjacent to the rehabilitated areas. So when the topsoil, for example, that's moved away is returned to the area after mining, that the biological life that's in that area is one, intentionally returned, but it also has the opportunity for natural return from the adjacent unmined forest. And something that is continuing is research to improve the quality of that rehabilitation. So, okay, so getting on to the decarbonisation slide, and I've only got 2 slides of this, so please don't panic. But I'll just first of all start with the overall perspective. Alcoa's intention is, so starting with the aluminium side, which is the most greenhouse gas intensive. A bit of history here, which I was quite amused by. The electrolytic reduction process for aluminium was actually invented in a uni student's woodshed. So Charles Martin Hall, I think he was 23 years old, was studying chemistry at college, and in his back shed actually reduced aluminium to alumina to metal in a process that is actually quite related to the current technology, and went on to be one of the founders of Alcoa. He can't take all the credit though, because simultaneously Frenchman Paul Hérault invented the process in France, and hence the combined name for the process. And what it involves is dissolving alumina in synthetic cryolite at about 950 degrees. The cryolite acts as a solvent for the alumina, allowing it to be reduced. And in the reaction in the smelting pot, liquid aluminium forms and is drawn out. And significantly for decarbonisation, at the anode, the oxygen that came from reducing the alumina reacts with the carbon anode, and that's a source of about 20% of the CO2 emissions from the smelting process. It's for Alcoa's decarbonisation journey, it's very important. Currently, the smelters run 87% on renewables globally, and hence that transition in terms of energy supply to the smelters has markedly reduced the greenhouse gas emissions from the smelting side, but it doesn't abate the CO2 emissions from this anode reaction. And there's a technology that Alcoa is developing in collaboration with Rio Tinto called ELYSIS, which is an inert anode technology. Interesting, Apple is actually also putting some funding into that, and I think some iPhones and MacBooks have got ELYSIS zero carbon aluminium in them now, but the quantities that are being produced at the moment are very small. Just wanted to mention, so this is not decarbonising smelting, but recycling. There's also a technology that Alcoa is developing called Australia, which people mistake for an Australian accent, staying in Australia, but anyway, I'm not sure where the name came from. That allows poor quality aluminium containing scrap to be upgraded to high quality metal. So a really important component of the aluminium journey. So on the refining side, which is the area that we have running in WA, so there's the two refineries currently with Alcoa, Kwinana, Catald, and obviously South 32 as well. The energy used in the refining process is largely in heating, so heating, cooling, evaporation of the process solution or liquor, and to a lesser degree electricity. And the heat is largely generated through cogeneration, where a electricity power plant produces electricity, and the heat produced as a byproduct of that electricity generation is used for heating in the refinery. The refinery uses less electricity in the current model than is produced in this process. It needs more heat than it does electricity. Hence the cogeneration opportunity. And the final step is calcination of the trihydroxide to alumina. And currently, through Alcoa, gas is used for that step. So I'm going to talk very generally here. There's areas where it's quite sensitive from a commercial point of view, but it's also an area where I think the industry is starting to learn to collaborate a bit more, because the problems are bigger than one industry. Some of them are very hard to solve. So first of all, process efficiency. In Alcoa's case, the refineries are definitely not perfect, so we're looking at improving the heat interchange, elements like yield from the process, so get as much out of the refinery that exists, and the heat that's used for things like evaporation as we can. And then absolutely key element is the electrification of the refinery. And for that to be successful requires sources of low carbon emission. What is more efficient is to use heat pumps, so a reverse cycle air conditioner is an example, and in a refinery you could take a lowish grade of heat and upgrade it to a high grade elsewhere in the process with a conventional heat pump. Or a more direct sort of heat pump is a thing called mechanical vapour recompression, where electricity is used to upgrade low-grade steam to high-grade steam that can be returned to a useful purpose in the process. And integral to all of this is storage, so some either heat storage, electricity storage, because the renewables as we know it at the moment are when the sun shines and the wind blows. And the other way of looking at that is load modulation. So currently we run consistently, we try and actually keep our plants as stable as possible, and it may be that the future involves turning things down and turning things up. So load modulation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we'll move straight on to Ryan Duncan from South 32, talking to us about decarbonisation again, and coming from the Decarbonisation Concept Studies Group.
Yeah, good evening. Thanks for inviting me to speak, and Chris, thanks for your presentation. It's going to be quite complementary to what I'm going to talk about tonight. So, yeah, my name's Ryan Duncan. I work for South 32 and I'm a study manager there. So where I sit in the group is the front end of the capital investment process. So before us comes our technical development group, and then as we progress things to a project stage, they get assigned a study manager, and then it progresses through various levels of definition and might turn into a large project. So that's where I fit in. How many of you have heard of South 32 before? Yep, everyone, that's good. How many of you know where we operate? Yep, a few. All right. So I'm just going to touch briefly on South 32, who we are, our commodities. Basically, we're a global mining and metals company, and we were spun out of BHP in 2015. As you can see, we have a global footprint, but a more diverse commodity base. So we're operating in 9 different commodities, which are critical to everyday life. We've got around about 10,000 employees working for us across 10 countries, and we're extremely active in the aluminium value chain. So, our EBITDA in FY24 was around about US $1.8 billion, and of that, about 26% came from the aluminium value chain. So, similar to Alcoa, we operate both alumina and aluminium smelters. In terms of the alumina assets, the major one that we've got here is Worsley Alumina in the southwest of WA, so near Collie, a little bit further south than Alcoa's Wagerup refinery. And we've also got Brazil Alumina operation and a smelter. We've got bauxite operations in Brazil as well, and the majority of our smelting capacity is in South Africa through Mozelle and Hillside. The South 32 approach to climate change, we've declared a long-term goal to achieve net zero by 2050 and a target to halve our operational emissions by 2035. But as Chris said, there's a lot of challenges in meeting the target and the goal. So how are we approaching it? Well, there's a number of different ways. The biggest one that we're doing is actually reshaping our portfolio. So recently, Illawarra Metallurgical Coal was an asset that's been divested from the group. So the strategy is to move away from these so-called dirty commodities and focus on the critical minerals for the future green economy. So that's one way we can reshape our portfolio, but the preferred way is really decarbonising our operations. So investing in the technology to transition our highest emitting operations to a zero emissions footprint in the future. So to do that, we're focusing on the larger emitters, which you can see here in FY23, this is Scope 1 and Scope 2. So Scope 1 is basically our directly controllable emissions, and Scope 2 is emissions that we would generate from pulling from a grid or something like that. So the majority of emissions that we have are from Hillside Aluminium, which is a smelter, Illawarra Metallurgical Coal, which is no longer part of the group, and Worsley Alumina, which is our alumina refinery down south. And you can see the other aluminium smelter there. So a total of 21 million tonnes in FY21. So alumina, it's a hard to abate industry, and I think Chris touched on that, and I'm going to come back to it in a second. But in terms of the asset itself, it's a long life asset, and it's got significant regional economic impact. So we employ around about 2,400 employees and contractors. And domestically, we're spending over $1 billion in the local economy. In 2021, our baseline emissions were 3.75 million tonnes, and we have decreased from that in recent years. But just to give you a feel for the size and scale of that, as a single facility, that's around about 0.8% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions in 2021, so quite large. So you can see a little bit of a layout here. So Alcoa's mines, we mine near Boddington, and it's conveyed down to the refinery, and similar to Alcoa, we rail our finished product to the Bunbury port and export out of the port there. So why is it so hard to abate? The purpose of this is to really just give you a feel for the energy intensive nature of it. So Chris touched on this. The energy consumption by Australian alumina refineries, and this is the 6 of them in 2020, is approximately 221 petajoules. So if you compare alumina refinery to, say, Tasmania on the top there, as an industry, we're using double the energy that state is using. So really, really energy intensive. But as Chris said, the refineries here in WA and in Australia are some of the most efficient ones in the world. They're in the second quartile of emissions. So Chris spoke a little bit about this. Where are the emissions generated in the Bayer process? We use coal and gas, and they co-generate electricity as part of the process, but the majority of that energy is converted into steam, which is used to heat the caustic and dissolve the alumina. So mining is a small component of the overall greenhouse gas emissions, around about 3%. The majority of it's in the Bayer process, 75%, and then calcination's the remaining 20%. So calcination's also similar to Alcoa, done through a gas method. A little bit of a difference to Alcoa, we are partially converted coal to gas, and we're going through a bit of a fuel transition now, which we'll talk about in a second. So you can see on the right, our emissions have been reducing over time, and one of the key things that's driving that is the changed fuel mix. So if you see here, our coal as a source of emissions in FY21 has now decreased because we're using less of it and we're using more gas. Gas is less emissions intense than coal, so that's where some of the near-term savings are coming. So In terms of a decarbonisation pathway and where we're heading, in the short term, we're focused on coal to gas conversions at Worsley Alumina. So moving from the from the more intense to the less intense fuel. And also reducing steam demand. So a very similar sort of approach to Alcoa, where we're looking at energy efficiency, make the refinery as efficient as you can, use the lowest emission source fuel. In the medium term, we are looking at electrification, and Chris touched on some of those technologies. So things like electric boilers, mechanical vapour recompression and heat pumps. There has been some industry trials done on some of those technologies, and to give you a bit of a feel for why electrification is quite challenging, if we were to go and electrify our Bayer process steam requirements using just an e-boiler, it would use about 80% of the electricity that Peter Dutton's proposed nuclear power plant would generate, and that's for one alumina refinery. So significant energy use. Because of that, it's less preferred to go and get a high technology readiness application such as an e-boiler, and that's why we're focused on things like mechanical vapour recompression, so using renewable power to upgrade the low grade steam and energy into a higher grade process energy, which is going to take a few years, because the technology of mechanical vapour recompression, it's used in other industries, but it's not yet applied widely in alumina, and there's some challenges in developing that. So the studies are underway as to how we do that, and a co-commitment to actually making that work is some of the things Chris was talking about. So we need to have the renewable generation, we need to have the transmission infrastructure in place, and we also need to be able to firm that variable renewable power. So there's these three key enablers that we need to support our electrification journey. So quite challenging. In the longer term, we're still investigating how we abate the emissions associated with calcination, but similar to Alcoa, we're focused on hydrogen calcination or electric calcination as a potential way to do that. And I think that's about all I had tonight, so I might leave it there. I think I'm on time.
Thank you, Ryan. That was a whistle-stop tour, so thank you very, very much. Our next speaker is Louise Edmonds from Carbon Sink, and going to talk to us about insetting projects.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today. So Carbon Sink is a carbon farming project developer. We work in cropping and grazing systems in the entirety of the Southwest Land Division, from Geraldton to Esperance and right down into the corner. And what we essentially do is support farmers to enhance the health of their farm ecosystem, and the way that we measure that is by measuring the amount of carbon that's in the soil. And when we're increasing carbon in the soil, we're creating carbon credits. What I'm going to talk today about is mainly insetting and its relation to offsetting. So insetting and offsetting are very hot topics in agriculture because there is a degree of competition or perceived competition between these two activities. But I'll essentially share with you what it's all about in agriculture. So, okay, so just to go back to what it is that Carbon Sink is really trying to achieve. So we want to position agriculture as a solution to climate change, biodiversity loss, and improved human and animal health. We plan to do this by demonstrating through ecosystem monitoring, collection of high integrity environmental and economic data that agriculture can be managed to restore the health of ecosystems, that farmers are stewards of the land whose work provides benefits beyond the farm gate, and that the market and broader community values this benefit, and that rural communities are wonderful places to live and work. So we've got insetting and offsetting. So I'm going to start with offsetting. Offsetting is fairly well understood. So offsetting is when carbon removals or emissions reductions or avoidance outside of the company's value chain. So Carbon Sink has been funded by Chevron Chevron is Australia's largest industrial emitter. It has a very large carbon liability, and as the aluminium industry has a similar challenge, it's very hard for them to decarbonise their industry. So one of the ways that they can compensate for the pollution is to get somebody else to remove that pollution, and that's what we do. So that's an example of offsetting. Now, insetting is quite different. So insetting occurs when you make an emissions, you reduce emissions inside a company's value chain. And this is something that's a very big thing in agriculture. So I'll show you an example of that. All right, did I miss that slide? Okay, so here is an example of an insetting program. Now, in agriculture, insetting is often sponsored by the off-taker of the commodity. So, for example, we might have wheat. So Kellogg's is a huge purchaser of wheat in Australia. And Kellogg's works within its supply chain, so it works with the farmers to support the farmers to reduce their emissions. The Cool Soil Initiative is an Australian collaboration between a big group of off-takers, purchasers of agricultural commodities, mainly grains and oilseeds. So do people understand the different scopes in greenhouse gas emissions? Okay, I'll just quickly go over it. So we talk about scopes. So we have scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3. So scope 1 emissions are generally those emissions that you have control over in your business. In this example, Kellogg's producing the box of Just Right would be in control of processing and packaging. It's unlikely that Kellogg's would also be in control of transportation, and Kellogg's is most definitely does not have control of agriculture. So scope 1 for Kellogg's is processing packaging. Scope 2 is purchased electricity. So that's really simple. That's the same across the board. And then you have scope 3, right? So scope 3 can happen upstream and downstream. So in this situation, Just Right, the downstream scope 3 emissions are those that are generated through agricultural production, and the upstream scope 3 emissions are the transportation of the box of Just Right to Woolworths. Yeah? So this is quite interesting. This 740 gram box of Just Right is responsible for 2,590 grams of CO2e. And of that 2,590 grams of CO2e, nearly 70% of that comes from activities that sit inside the farm gate. So for a company like Kellogg's, which is a multinational company, I believe, you know, they have requirements for emissions reductions that are imposed at, you know, another jurisdiction, another company's level. Due to the size of their company, they have investor pressure, shareholder pressure. And so when a company like Kellogg's puts out an emissions reduction target or strategy, they actually have to have a pathway towards achieving that. They can't just say that they're going to do that and completely miss the target and actually not lift a finger and do nothing at all, because the consequences for them can be quite serious. So somehow they have to influence the activities of the farmers, which is an incredibly difficult thing to do. All right? So that's your scope 3 emissions scenario. So let's have a look at what this 68% of emissions is made up of. So we talk about scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3. So now I'm talking about the scopes of emissions that the farmer is responsible for. So in this situation, you've got scope 1 being the fuel that they use. So they have control of the fuel usage. They're using their tractors. They're making decisions as to how they use them. Applications of lime, fertiliser, burning of stubbles if they still continue to do that, the breakdown of crop residue, and atmospheric deposition from various activities. Now you'll see here that electricity consumption here is very small, it's only 0.41%. And then we have scope 3 emissions for the farmer. So scope 3 emissions here are in relation to the production of the fertiliser and the pesticides and the transportation of the fertiliser and the pesticides to the farm. So when we look at this, if we were to say, okay, what do we have some kind of influence over? So we may have influence over the use of lime, fertiliser. We can choose not to burn. So here we have, let's say 30%, 13%, so that's 43%. Now if we cut, let's say we cut the fertiliser in half, then over here we've got another 14%, so that's 50%. You know, in agricultural inputs alone, we've got 70% of the actual greenhouse gas emissions profile behind the gate. So that's very significant. So how do we influence that? So some of the activities that a farmer could undertake to reduce their emissions is to improve the health of their soil, reducing the requirements for fertilisers, pesticides and herbicides. They could integrate more diversity into the cropping system, implement practices like cover cropping, intercropping, pasture cropping. They could shift from synthetic to non-synthetic forms of fertilisers, for example using biochar, rock dust, biological pest control, compost pellets, and they could use technology like virtual fencing to enhance livestock productivity. So there are a huge amount of things that farmers can do, but in agriculture change is slow and things need to be proven, and farmers need to touch, feel and see other farmers being successful, and preferably other farmers in their own, within 100 kilometres of themselves, for them to want to embrace these kinds of changes. So while you have technical problems here in terms of decarbonisation, I'd say the primary challenge that we have in agriculture are social and cultural challenges. So what relationship does this have to carbon sink? So you can't store carbon in soil by managing agricultural land from an industrial paradigm. You need to shift to more of an eco-agricultural approach to agricultural management, which are many of the practices that we mentioned on the previous slide. And so by default, when farmers work with us, they not only remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they also reduce their emissions. And that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Our last speaker for tonight is Natasha Rogers, and she's coming to talk to us from WARRL and is going to talk to us about recycling of aluminium and other things.
So, as my name's Natasha, I consult with WARRL and have done for the last 4 years, about 4.5 years. I look after all their recyclers and material recovery facilities, their contracts that engage with the scheme, the container deposit scheme in Western Australia. But before I go into that, I'll just explain just a few discussion points we're going to cover tonight. So we're just going to look at the container recycling in WA, also some aluminium markets that we work within using the aluminium recovered from container packaging, and some opportunities that are being investigated within Australia around recycling aluminium. So to begin with, a nice bright slide here, because I know I'm between you and some food. WA WARRL, which is a much easier way to say it, is the WA Recycle Renew Limited. I always get those R's all mixed up. We are actually the scheme coordinator of the Container Deposit Scheme in Western Australia. It's a not-for-profit entity. We're very similar to the scheme that's operated in Queensland and also one of the zones in Victoria. As part of that, being a not-for-profit, all of the refund point operators that you see throughout Western Australia, they are actually private entities. So we don't own those, they are actually their own private businesses. We report to DEWA and the WA government, and we actually sit within the Waste Avoidance Recovery Act, which was amended to incorporate the Container Deposit Scheme in 2019. That feeds into the federal Act, which is the Recycling and Waste Reduction Act. Both of those acts have a mandate sitting within them of around recycling, reuse, recovery, reduce, which is what the activities that we engage in within the scheme. So I don't actually have a lot of slides, but I'm going to talk a lot about these particular slides. The container deposit schemes throughout all jurisdictions in Australia. We have Victoria that's just come on board. Tasmania will be coming on board probably within the next year or so. Once Tasmania is on board, we will actually be the first country in the world with every single jurisdiction having a container deposit scheme, which is quite interesting. What it actually is an extended producer responsibility scheme. And what that means is that the manufacturer pays for the scheme. So that is your PepsiCo, Lion, your Coca-Cola. They pay for the scheme. They project what they are going to put into the market, and they pay per container that they put into the market. We then recover those containers and we charge them for what we've recovered. So by doing that, you have this producer responsibility that pays for the entire logistics chain. That starts with, I'll just press the, hold on, right button? No, hold on. That's manufacturer there. So they sell into the market, they'll sell to your Woolworths and your Coles. Your consumer will go and pay a deposit at the point of purchase. That deposit can vary between the retailers, anywhere between 6 and 10 cents. The consumers then incentivised to go to a refund point to get their 10 cents back because they've paid their deposit, they now want it back. So they can take it back to a refund point, and this is the same all throughout Australia. Currently it's 10 cents and that will remain the same price right throughout Australia. And just before anybody asks me, wine bottles are not coming in just yet, just before anybody asks, or nor will milk. So that's another one that I get asked all the time. The actual refund point operators themselves are paid a fee to process that return and also to source separate all the materials into the various material streams. So the glass, the plastic, aluminium, plus also the liquid paperboard, steel, and then you have others. Processors then come along, collect those materials in their single source separated streams. They bale it and get it ready for auction. That auction portal, this is where I come into the scheme, is we have approved recyclers. They make an application to the scheme to be able to have access to the auction portal to buy the material. Before they get approved, there's a lot of due diligence that takes place. So we look at what do they do with this material, what are they recycling it into, are they exporting it, is it being done in Australia? And the preference is always a circular outcome where it can be recycled back into a container again or back into a high value item. Once that's done, then they can then purchase on the auction portal, and we set pricing with that, and generally it's around about between 60 and 70% of the LME of aluminium pricing globally. At the recycler end with aluminium, all the recyclers that buy aluminium in Australia are all traders because we actually don't have any aluminium recycling in Australia. And there's a very important difference to point out that we have smelters which actually produce the alumina, but for recycling you have to have remelters. So we have discussions with primary producers like Rio Tinto, and at Boyne Island there's been some trials of doing remelting where they close a portion of their production and they will try and do some remelting. Tomago in New South Wales is conducting a trial with Capral around looking at trying to recycle 500 tonnes of post-industrial Capral scrap. So there's a very important difference because people assume aluminium smelter it's easy to recycle. It's not. It's a very different process. The recyclers, the aluminium traders that buy the aluminium from us, and at this point it's now termed a UBC. So it's UBC aluminium, which is a used beverage can. They then export this offshore. So currently we send just under 50%, it's about 48.9%, off to Korea, which has the largest production of aluminium remillers and also remelters. The rest of it, we send some to Malaysia and some to Thailand. We know that there's not rolling mills in either of those countries of any great scale, so they generally will aggregate it in a remelter and send it as briquettes to Korea to then rolling mills. So there's a lot of, you can see through the value chain, there's a lot of environmental footprint being added up in this process. Once it's sent to a secondary material processor, which is the rolling mill, it's then sent back to Australia as basically aluminium sheet. And that sheet is supplied into the canneries. And we have two major canneries in Australia, which is Aurora and Visy. They actually manufacture all the containers for the beverage industry in Australia. So they've got canneries, I think there's about 14 different outlets throughout, and you will find that one cannery will actually just do the body of the can, because there's different thicknesses. So you have different thicknesses in can production, and then you have the end. So the top, they fill it, and then they put the top on in the manufacturer. So then it goes back to the manufacturer, and the cycle starts all over again. So in WA, we actually have a recovery rate of 68.7% of UBC in the market. So that's all the products that are sold into the market. It's coming back through the container deposit scheme. This is actually higher than what the national average is of aluminium that's recovered from the marketplace. So it's actually quite good. In terms of can recycling, and this is where you'll see the difference, so we generate 92 kilotons through can recycling, can consumption in Australia. Of that, only 74% is recovered. Now you can see 25% is actually still sent to landfill. In WA, we have two waste-to-energy plants about to fire up. One already has fired up, and the other one is in the process of firing up. We are currently looking at, in that process, is there a way to further extract those resources in the char that they produce at the other end, to be able to then try and reduce that 25% going into landfill. So that's an investigation that I'm going underway at the moment with the two operators of the waste-to-energy plants. Out of that 74% that's sent offshore, only 48% is back to can. And this is a direct result of either the traders who are selling into markets that don't produce cans, or it's heavily contaminated and the product can't be used in can remanufacture. And that's a really critical part when you're talking about material recovery facilities and what happens in your curbside bin. So that's 74% recovery rate. When you're talking, that's a total recovery rate of aluminium cans. Through the container deposit schemes, it's an average of 65%. So that other 9% is recovered through your yellow curbside bin. I do get asked this a lot. Do we actually recycle the material that goes into your yellow curbside bin? I look after the 9 material recovery facilities in WA, and I can tell you absolutely yes, because the value of aluminium is sitting at around between $2,000 and $2,800 a tonne. They are absolutely going to be extracting that. So yes, they do. Most of the MRFs operate around about between 88 to about 92% recovery rate of the material that goes into your curbside yellow bin. Where there's a discrepancy is if they pick up a load that's heavily contaminated, it won't even make it to the material recovery facility. It will literally just get diverted straight to landfill. So really important tip today, don't put stuff that you shouldn't in your yellow bin. The other 26% gets diverted into other products and it will be mixed with other items. So what does that look like for Australia in the future? So aluminium recycling in Australia is being investigated, but what is driving the desire and a lot of the business cases is the ESG targets. So that's your environmental, social and governance targets. Most companies will fall into one of the tiers, tier 1, 2 or 3, where they will actually have to report on their ESG targets and their ESG compliance and usage within their business. That is driving innovation in energy, and we've already heard from the alumina producers and processors that energy is a very big lever and also a big barrier to having low carbon aluminium being produced. So that is actually driving a lot of innovation and also circularity targets. The forecast, global forecast at the moment is there's going to be a 40% growth in global demand that is being driven. And I'm just talking about UBC here. I'm not talking about the wider aluminium market. This is just UBC. So, and aluminium for beverage cans and packaging. We're seeing that growth mostly as people transition from heavier items like glass and also plastic. We've seen quite a shift in plastic consumption that has been dropping a bit, and then aluminium is really picking up. But aluminium is actually replacing glass in a lot of places, and for obvious reasons. So that growth is then, you've got this UBC currently only represents 10% of the total aluminium that's put into the market and available for recycling in Australia. This again comes back to this renewable energy. So there's a lot of work being done in how to create sustainable renewable energy for heavy resource dependent manufacturing, and recycling is definitely one of them. So I was looking at, there's circularity precincts that are being set up, and one of them is in Parks in New South Wales. I was going to use that as an example, where they're actually co-locating renewable energy sources alongside manufacturing and other industries. So they very similar to what's happening in Kwinana Hub, but that's developed like a next level along there. So this is actually being seen as one of the biggest areas where we need to have innovation and drive the innovation. Just for an example, one from New South Wales, the Tomago plant uses 34% of New South Wales power. So it is a really key part of any future recycling of this. So just to wrap up, the benefits, even though we only represent 10% of the total market, of aluminium market, we're consumer driven, and we have that consumer behaviour which can be transferred into a wider industry. If we can have behaviour change around people thinking about aluminium or any packaging as a resource that can be recovered and recycled as opposed to just some waste, then it can also be transferred into the building industry, into other industries where that same thinking applies, and we can then bring that behaviour change into recovering more aluminium, because as we've heard before from the guys that are producing aluminium, it takes a lot less energy to recycle it than what it does to actually create it in the first place. So the extended producer responsibility provides a framework, a highly regulated framework. You've got a lot of accountability, there's a lot of transparency in it, but you also have social and community benefits, which are driven by that incentive to fundraise and to get their money back. So that has, in WA especially, we have 48% of our refund point operators are social enterprises, which has been had a fundamental shift in a lot of those entities on how they can operate their business and deliver services across a wide range within their local communities. The trials, there's a trial going on at the moment, which is still underway, between Capral Aluminium and the Tomago smelter in New South Wales, on looking at how they can actually remelt 500 tonnes of post-industrial scrap from the Capral manufacturing plant. What this is doing is, and what they're investigating is there an opportunity to create smaller format remelters as opposed to these large-scale traditional industries that we've set up before, and which is what was around 30, 40, 50 years ago with the automotive industry, where we had a really good offtake in the automotive industry that was using aluminium, that we now no longer have that aluminium, the automotive industry in Australia. So we don't have that market. And that's a really critical part to any recycling value chain. If you do not have an offtake partner at the end of it, we can recycle all we like, but all we're going to end up is warehouses full of recycled material and no market to take it to. So there needs to be that offtake solution at the other end, and that's what we're looking at with Capral and Tomago. And again, we come back to this energy solution. Having these large-scale renewable energy solutions is a really key lever to actually increasing and improving recycling within Australia. And as I said, I've used Parks in New South Wales as an example. So that sort of gives you a wrap-up of just a very quick overview of how our little 10% of aluminium UBC can actually drive some quite important change around people's perceptions and behaviours around aluminium recycling and all packaging recycling in Australia. And thank you very much.
I want to say thank you very much to our speakers tonight for putting together their presentations, and they all worked beautifully together. Thank you very, very much. And we have a little present for you guys for coming and speaking to us tonight. Please come up.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Professional photography. Terry, you too, smile.
So I just want to say again a big thank you. It's wonderful and it was brilliant, and we'll get to ask you questions outside hopefully.